Hello to everyone joining us this morning. It's wonderful to have so many people with us today. I can hear everyone coming in to officially launch the Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy Standards, a world first here in Scotland. So thank you for choosing to spend your morning with us, and we hope to make it worth your while. If we go on to the next slide, Hannah, that would be great. Happy International Women's Day also. This theme this year is to inspire inclusion, and it'll be Lillian and I, if we go back, co-chairing today's event. So we'll be doing our best to do just that, inspiring and including you, our guests, through until 11:30 with the support of colleagues and a fabulous range of speakers on the agenda today, including Siobhian Brown, Minister for Victims and Community Safety, Helen, our Authentic Voice panel member from SafeLives, our DACA project team, whose names you can see on the slide, and Emma Forbes, Principal Procurator Fiscal for Domestic Abuse. As you saw on the previous slide, it's myself, Jess Denniff from SafeLives Scotland, and Lillian Lispel chairing today's event. So if we go on to the next slide, thank you, Hannah. As some of you will know, the Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy Project is delivered in partnership between SafeLives Scotland and Assist, the largest provider of court advocacy in the country, covering Glasgow and the west of Scotland, from Oban to Stranraer. Go next slide, please. The project began in 2022, funded by the Scottish Government's Victim-Centred Approach Fund, with the aims, as we can see on the slide here, of working towards a Scotland where everyone has access to accredited criminal domestic abuse court advocacy when required, to improve the safety and feelings of being heard and empowered for clients in that process, in the criminal court process. Thirdly, increasing the confidence of professionals navigating a justice system alongside victims, and finally, to increase the effectiveness, validity, visibility and consistency of the court advocacy role across Scotland. It's an ambitious project, as you can tell, with three main tangible outputs on the right of the slides, of which the standards are one, and which guests today will have been sent a copy of this morning. Lillian.
Yeah, so this morning we hope to give you all a deeper understanding of the domestic abuse court advocacy DACA standards, where they've come from and how they came to be, as well as where they will take us next. For some of you, this may be the first time that you're hearing about the project and the standards, whereas others will have been part of the creation of the standards, the project and the wider work in this space. Over 260 practitioners and many victims and survivors of domestic abuse from across Scotland were involved in the design of these standards, many of whom will be here today. We will hear more about their input in today's event, and we want to thank everyone who's contributed their lived, learned and professional experience to this work. Next slide, please.
So just a bit of housekeeping from us. Today is primarily a launch and celebration, and whilst our aim is to make this space as positive and welcoming for all members of our audience as possible, there will be necessary discussion of domestic abuse, experiences within the justice system, and other topics that may impact those in the room. So please do what's right for you in terms of attending today, listening in and taking breaks as required during and after the event. As we say, cameras are off for our guests, other than speakers and ourselves. So again, do what's right for you. As I said earlier, but as people were coming in, today's event is being hosted on MS Teams, Microsoft Teams, and being run as an event. So chat facilities will not be available until a Q&A that we hope to host at the end of the event. Cameras are switched off, and our intention is to share the recording with attendees and approved clips externally once approved with speakers.
Okay. Yeah, so today marks a significant step forward in our collective journey towards Scotland having high quality nationwide court advocacy, mitigating the postcode lottery that exists for victims currently. We know that victims of domestic abuse often relocate to manage their safety, and this would ensure that they would have access to court advocacy regardless of where they live. We will move through today's events, beginning with wider reflections on the justice system in Scotland, before then launching the standards and, time allowing, a brief Q&A. With that in mind, we're very pleased to welcome Siobhian Brown, Minister for Victims and Community Safety, to open today's event with a keynote speech. Thank you, Siobhian.
Thank you so much, Lillian, and Jessica. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the kind invitation to give the opening address at the launch of the Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy Standards. I'm especially pleased to be giving the address as we celebrate International Women's Day. It's also really lovely to see so many familiar faces and organisations here today online. This is a testament to the significance of the work of SafeLives and the development of standards. Today is a global day for celebration, one which marks a call to action for accelerating gender equality. Today is also a day for us to recognise the importance of collaborative work being progressed by organisations across Scotland, many of which are represented here today. I want to therefore start by thanking you all for the vast array of services which support women and girls across the country. I'd like to congratulate SafeLives and assist on the development of the Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy Standards, which has been supported through the assistance of Scottish Government Victim-Centred Approach Fund. The launch of these standards is an important milestone in providing support to victims as they navigate a complex justice system, alongside increased consistency of the court advocacy role in Scotland. Standards provide the benchmark through which service provision can develop and measure progress. As such, I'm keen to see how we move from the concept of standards into practice and how we use this to develop the provision of court advocacy across Scotland and how we encourage organisations to work towards their adoption. I know my officials are working with SafeLives to discuss next steps, including the opportunity to build on this work to look at court advocacy for children. That said, the project has another year's work to progress, and there is much to discuss before we broaden our horizons still further. All of this, of course, has been possible through our Victim-Centred Approach Fund, which is providing £48 million to 23 organisations over the period from 2022 to 2025. And this includes £18.5 million for specialist advocacy support for survivors of gender-based violence. And I'm delighted that some of the organisations which this funding supports are present here today. That fund has engendered a collaborative approach and enabled projects to learn from each other and to identify areas of commonality, which bodes well for future service delivery. And as we all know, violence against women has a profound impact on women and girls' lives, with detriments to health, well-being, financial stability, and the fulfilment of potential, and for gender equality. Addressing these impacts is a vision that is at the heart of the Equally Safe Scotland strategy to prevent and eradicate violence against women. Co-owned between the Scottish Government and COSLA, the strategy sets out a vision of a strong and flourishing country where all individuals are equally safe and respected, and where women and girls live free from all forms of violence and abuse and the attitudes that help to perpetrate it. The Equally Safe strategy and its refresh provides a framework for action to prevent and eradicate all forms of violence against women and girls. Recent engagement with our partners across the sector provided an opportunity for us to reflect on recent societal changes and understand the key issues that we must address to achieve positive outcomes for women and girls. I'm grateful to everyone who shared their expertise to help create an ambitious, refreshed strategy that we can be proud of. And of course, to complement this work, we have £19 million of annual funding from our Delivery Equally Safe Fund, which has been running since October 2021, supporting 121 projects from 112 organisations. I think it is worth to reflect that almost 32,000 people have benefited from support services in the first year of delivering Equally Safe Fund, and the stories of the transformative impact of their lives demonstrates the importance of this work. Tackling incidents of domestic abuse, of course, has been and continues to be a priority for the Scottish Government and for our justice partners. However, we recognise that there is more that can be done and that there are areas where improvement must take place. We recognise the need to scrutinise and review the effectiveness of existing legislative interventions and the time taken for cases to progress through the court process. I'm also committed to learn from the experiences of those who interact with our justice system and support services. I'm proud of the considerable work that is underway across the sector and the many areas that this government and many organisations across Scotland are focusing on. I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly outline some of the key areas which highlight the collaborative approach to our policy priorities. The Scottish Government remains committed to working with stakeholders to progress the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act 2021 to ensure its effective and sustainable implementation across Scotland. When implemented, this legislation will provide new powers to individuals at risk of harm. This includes restrictions in order to provide immediate protection from suspected domestic abuse. An operational working group and implementation board comprising of justice stakeholders are continuing to work through the details of the operational impact of this legislation. I know the group met last month and will meet again towards the end of March. The Scottish Government remains committed to working with stakeholders to deliver a scheme that realises the intended benefits of the legislation, and the collaboration will continue to happen in this work. In December 2022, the Scottish Government established a task force to provide national leadership for the development and the implementation of a multi-agency domestic homicide and suicide review model for Scotland. The Scottish model will be built on a set of core principles which will include being person-centred, trauma-informed, transparent, inclusive, and domestic abuse competent. The task force continues to drive this work forward, working closely and collaboratively with multi-agency partners. The task force will also develop an effective monitoring and evaluation framework to ensure the effectiveness of the model once it's implemented. And in the coming weeks, we will be publishing a paper on identifying best practice in learning lessons and implementing change, an excellent step as we progress this work forward. It is fair to say that the task force and the approach taken has generated considerable interest, both here at home but also internationally, with officials being invited to speak at a number of conferences with peers. We're committed to getting this right and have embarked on our approach, which will deliver a robust and tangible outcomes. Finally, I'd like to outline the collaborative work of the Justice Partners Roundtable, which coordinates a collective response to recent research and evaluation reports in conjunction with a broader look across the domestic abuse policy landscape to understand where there are areas for development. The Roundtable continues to look across a number of areas, including improving the evidence base alongside improving the victim experience. Improving and enhancing data has been a key consideration, and I hope to be able to say more about that once the work has concluded. The Roundtable is also looking at how we can better reflect on lived experience to inform policy development and our operational processes and practices. A number of our ongoing projects and key priority areas are being looked at, including training for operational partners in how best to support victims, as well as a summary case management pilot. While the summary case management pilot applies to all summary criminal cases, there is a specific focus on domestic abuse casework. It is currently being piloted in Dundee, Hamilton, Paisley, and Glasgow. The Glasgow expansion, which started in January this year, includes all domestic abuse courts. Summary case management provides a new way of working which increases efficiency and improves the quality of service to domestic abuse victims and witnesses. We have seen positive outcomes with many more victims and witnesses benefiting from more cases being resolved at an early stage, and a reduction in unnecessary witness citations and court hearings. And as we progress these priority areas, we will continue to work collaboratively and constructively wherever possible. We must continue working together, supporting the synergy between policy and operational practice. The Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy Standards is an excellent demonstration on how we can work together, and I look forward to the continued development of this work. Can I commend SafeLives for bringing us all here together on International Women's Day? That's the most important bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, for your powerful speech there and reflecting on the work of all of those in the space with us. That was fantastic, as well as this specific SafeLives and Assist co-delivered project. The insight into your future priorities and plans and the ongoing pilots will have been hugely appreciated by many of the audience. So thank you for that. My ears certainly pricked up as I heard that focus on an evidence base alongside victim experience, which is something this DACA project has really strived to deliver as well. So also fantastic to hear that recommitment and reaffirmed government commitment to a future for action to prevent and eradicate all forms of FORG, including domestic abuse, and for this project. So thank you so much for joining us today, and happy International Women's Day. Thank you, Siobhan.
Thanks very much.
So it's now my pleasure to welcome Helen, a member of the wonderful SafeLives Authentic Voice panel, to share her personal reflections and experience on the justice system, courts, and this project. So good morning, Helen. You will hear more later on how lived experience and authentic voice has been central to this project throughout. But here and for now, Helen will be taking centre stage in what I know is going to be an amazing input. So again, just a warning to please do what's right for you when listening in, and a huge thank you to Helen, and over to you whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Jess, and good morning, everybody. I think it's fair to say the reality of what should be expected in terms of support for a victim of domestic abuse from the point of making a complaint to the police through to the court process can be very different from what actually happens, and that was certainly the case for me. Hi, my name is Helen. I'm a mum. For my daytime job, I work for a charity supporting visually impaired people, and I am a member of the Authentic Voice panel for SafeLives. Back in January last year, I was asked if I would like to attend one of the multi-agency workshops. One of the questions asked was, what does the advocacy going to court look like for victims in my area? This is where I first saw the huge gap of what everyone thought was happening and what the reality actually was. I first made a complaint to the police in around May 2017, and the case finally came to court in February 2020. Now, I realise that seems quite a long time, but I wasn't the only victim. I was living in Fife, and the police officer who I was in contact with was absolutely brilliant and supported me through the whole process of giving statements. It was then transferred over to the police in Dundee for further investigations. Once their investigations were all finished, it was up to COPFS to decide if it was going to court or not. At that point, I received a letter from someone at VIA, which was Victim Information and Advice, outlining what to expect moving forward and leaving a contact number for me. Now, whilst I was grateful for this, it didn't amount to very much, as unfortunately the contact name I had been given had been signed off work on long-term sick. On the first occasion I did phone the number, it was an answer phone, and no one contacted me back. This meant there was very little to no support whatsoever during this time. I was also never introduced to an IDA, so didn't have any support from them either. As the trial date drew nearer, I was contacted by Aberdeen High Court and asked if I'd like to come and visit so I could familiarise myself with the courtroom. I could see where the judge would be sitting and where the jury would be. I was also reassured there would be screens in place and it would be a closed court. Another one of my biggest fears was having to walk in through the front door on the day and risk the chance of seeing the accused. My visit to the court meant I was able to see where I could enter via a separate door, meaning I could bypass the main entrance and the reduce of bumping into him. This visit before the trial was invaluable. The trial took place in February 2020, but due to the pandemic, sentencing didn't take place until December 2020. Unfortunately, I wasn't informed prior to the date and I missed the opportunity to attend the court, although I recognise that due to the rules in place because of the pandemic, I may not have been able to do so. I first heard about the terms and length of sentencing from the police, who telephoned me to tell me. For me, this was the one thing that I really wanted to be in court for. It was my chance to demonstrate to him that I was credible and I had been believed and that he was now accountable for his actions. At the time, I never questioned the lack of support because I did not know that it existed. I believed you reported a crime to the police, it was investigated, then your contact with the police ceased and it was passed to the COPFS. They then took time to decide whether it would go to trial. You then had to wait for all the different court processes to take place and you would be given a court date. Every step being very formal and bureaucratic. I'd like to ask you to imagine for a moment you're swimming in the sea. It is a lovely day and there are families and people enjoying themselves on the beach. You start to get into difficulty. Fear starts to creep in. You wave and shout to the people on the beach, but no one sees you and no one hears you. You start to panic. Fear grips you. Your heart starts to beat faster. Your chest begins to feel tight. 100 million thoughts flash through your mind. You fight to keep your head above the water, all the time shouting and waving, but still no one sees you or hears you. You take a deep breath as you slip below the surface, your lungs are on fire. Your only chance to survive is to fight with all your might. Now imagine the same scene, but this time, someone on the shore hears your cries. A lifeguard swims out and takes you in their arms. They reassure you, talk to you, and calm you. They support you and guide you back to the shore. Once there, they wrap a blanket around you and make sure you are safe. DACA and the standards that are being launched today are like the lifeguard. They are there to help, support, provide guidance and keep you safe and prevent you from drowning. If I had a final thought for today, it would be this. It has been a privilege for me to take part in the workshops, and I'd like the opportunity to thank Kirsty, Louise and Gemma for including survivors' voices in the process of putting together the standards. And I am hopeful and like to believe that these standards will help to prevent anyone else having the experience that I did, and that they provide the support needed to anyone going through the court process from the point of reporting it to the police and going through to trial. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you so very much for sharing your personal experience. It so very poignantly highlights what the experience of the criminal justice process can feel like. The value of contact and information and the missed opportunities that could potentially have made this a better experience. I think it also highlights the value and importance of lived experience for our DACA project. I think it's really hard to overstate how difficult it is for victims to cope alone with the violence and abuse from a perpetrator. And if you add to that the complex criminal justice system and the expectations placed on them to manage their own safety and that of their children, and the task that can come, then it's a task that can come virtually impossible. So thanks again, Helen. I think we've all really appreciated that contribution. I think it might be time for just a quick break for people. So just maybe a minute for people to switch off their cameras or to a break away from the screen and look after themselves. And then we'll come back at 10:29. Thank you. Okay. I know that was just a really short break, but just a moment to look away and take that in before we now move over to Kirsty. Kirsty was the head of SafeLives, well, the project lead for SafeLives in the first year of DACA, and we're really pleased to have her here today to celebrate. She will be outlining the project's foundations, the work that was undertaken to create the standards, in which lived experience was key, and her reflections on this. So Kirsty, over to you.
Thank you, Lillian. Hi, everybody. Happy International Women's Day. So I'll start talking about how we created the standards. We were fairly certain nothing like the DACA standards existed in Scotland. We were supported by some very experienced professionals who'd worked in this field for a long time. And then between Louise and I, we had quite a widespread knowledge. So in some ways, we knew that we were starting with a blank slate. We knew the standards had to be robust, defensible, justifiable, clear, and applicable. And this presented quite a challenge. So SafeLives' approach of using data, voice, and practice was a strong starting point for us. In terms of data, we wanted to be evidence-led. We knew that we needed to start any new area of work learning from what has and hasn't worked previously and examine what existing knowledge there already was in this field. So as a starting point, we commissioned a literature review by Dr. Claire McEwen. The review confirmed that there were pockets of guidance around domestic abuse and court advocacy. Broad themes of good practice had definitely been identified, but we didn't identify anywhere within English-speaking nations that had established DACA standards. We also drew upon excellent academic literature in Scotland. I won't name here as there's just too many to acknowledge, but the depth and the quality of work in this area was really supportive. Talking of voice, we know, and thank you again to Helen, that those with lived experience give us the most relevant insights into what works, what feels supportive, what is challenging, and what approaches are effective. So voice in this project was certainly the area where I learned the most about DACA and what is needed. We wanted to engage with people who had experienced domestic abuse and the criminal justice process, and this needed to be safe, ethical, and we learned quickly that we needed to be very tight around the parameters of what we had the remit and the ability to change. Our aim was to hear from a diverse group so that we could create standards that best reflected the various experiences across Scotland and across different demographics. The interviews and focus groups validated and emphasised some of what we already knew, but there were some real surprises as well. Inputs that changed the tone, the language, and even the purpose of the standards in some ways. Without the voice of people with lived experience, this would have been a guidance document for professionals by professionals, and we would have missed so much. In terms of practice, we needed to listen to the experiences of professionals working in this field and those that engaged with DACA services. In our approach to practitioners across Scotland, we began by speaking one-to-one with key professionals who worked in the field of domestic abuse and/or criminal justice, and we asked them what was important for the standards and in our research approach. We're really fortunate to be well resourced by the Scottish Government in year one, and this allowed us to plan in-person engagement events across Scotland. These engagements allowed us to map and scope current provision in every local authority area, identify best practice and identify the challenges that existed. We asked about the principles that should guide DACA standards as well. We gleaned really valuable information about what worked, the impact of local variation, and the importance of professional relationships. Something that was highlighted in every area that we visited was the number of professionals working out with their formal role to get the best outcomes for victims of domestic abuse. This was really heartening, but also very challenging for those professionals. The last point here is the Assist SafeLives partnership. So along with LAN, we created a qualitative research approach that took into account these three elements. We wanted to triangulate every one of the standards so that we knew there was evidence to support its inclusion from the existing evidence-based data, from people with lived experience, voice, and from those who knew this field inside and out practice. And LAN helped us recognise a fourth element, which was in effect my and Louise's brains, holding all of that knowledge and experience together, collating the information, analysing, balancing, drafting and redrafting over the first year of DACA. Guided by LAN and Steph and their research and their systems knowledge, that really kept us on track. So I've called that the Assist SafeLives partnership, but really that's far too modest, because what I'm really pointing out is how spectacular Louise, LAN, Steph and I were. In reality, it was a lot of sitting in rooms, holding our heads, paper everywhere, thinking about the implications of including or excluding certain elements, considering language a lot. There was a lot of thought and commitment that went into getting it right. So this is a visual representation of that chronological process of research and engagement between 2022 and 23. We began with the literature review and engaging with those highly experienced, knowledgeable professionals. And then in January 23, what better month to begin travel across Scotland, we started our stakeholder engagement events. We travelled from Fife to Dundee to Dumfries in 1 week, which was interesting. Then the Scottish borders to the Highlands, Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, Forth Valley, Argyll and Bute, Western Burtonshire, Renfrewshire, Inverclyde, the Lanarkshires, Edinburgh, East and Midlothian, Glasgow, West Lothian. We spoke specifically with staff from Assist and staff from Fear Free and Aditi, representing LGBT+ and Black, Asian and minority ethnic women respectively. And then we finished in Shetland, where we sensibly waited until May to go there. In total, we engaged with 245 professionals across 20 workshops, and we also conducted a survey which was completed by around 242 professionals. We also had additional sessions for practitioners who couldn't attend in person, one specifically for rural and island communities and one whole Scotland event. In terms of lived experience, we spoke with 4 focus groups, co-facilitated by Amina Muslim Women's Resource Centre in Dundee, Falkirk Council, Bernardo's and Aberlour's Still I Rise group, Scottish Women's Aid Survivor Reference Group, and we engaged a number of times with SafeLives Authentic Voice panel. We interviewed 12 additional individuals about their experience, supported by local IDA services, including Shetland Women's Aid, who we're really grateful to for their support with this project. We adopted an iterative approach where we asked survivors to submit feedback to their IDA or directly to us after interview, and we took account of what feedback they had submitted in our subsequent interviews. We also asked the AV panel to review our interview questions and resources ahead of engagements, and we adopted their feedback. Once we completed these engagements, the process of balancing and analysing began. We centred survivor voice and experience in our approach, but it was balanced against what professionals told us was legal and reasonable and what the evidence base provided. I'll now explain how we used the information to create the standards. So first here, workers are empathetic, non-judgmental and realistic is a good example to look at. So the first word there, empathetic. In interviews and workshops, words such as comfort, reassurance, believed, listening, trust, non-judgmental, compassionate and understood were used repeatedly when discussing the desired qualities of a DACA worker. The metaphor of having someone there to hold your hand was mentioned both by individuals with lived experience and professionals. A participant at the focus group of Black, Asian and minority ethnic women stated they would like a friendly person to be there for them. And echoing Emma Forbes' description of the DACA worker as the emotionally attuned expert, One workshop described the remit of the DACA worker as there to protect the emotional well-being of the client through the justice journey. A number of interviewees felt that they were used as a piece of evidence, the totality of their experience not recognised in court. And this is not a flaw in the court process, but rather it's not the purpose of the court case. So we discussed that the DACA worker should almost be the interface between the client and the court. We have to work within those existing systems, helping the client to understand the criminal justice process and their role as a complainer within that, and then signposting and referring them to other sources of emotional support as appropriate. So that was just for one word. Moving on to non-judgmental. This value came from a variety of sources. In discussions about the ideal domestic abuse court advocacy journey, the majority of practitioners mentioned that services shouldn't victim blame. Some domestic abuse frontline staff brought up the need to focus on language and understand how it can really impact on the client, particularly in how the actions of the client and the perpetrator are described. Some interviewees with lived experience also shared examples of specific phrases that had been used by professionals that they'd found harmful, judgmental, or that they felt they hadn't been believed. And others talked about how their worker had supported them to establish their credibility with other professionals. Lastly here, realistic. We heard the term managing expectations repeatedly across Scotland from practitioners, particularly in relation to what was required by a professional supporting somebody through a court case. However, when we discussed that with those with lived experience, most of them didn't have firm expectations. Rather, we found that they were not sufficiently informed to know what to expect at all, and they wanted realistic information. One person said, "You need to be prepared for what's coming or what's potentially coming. You do know yourself that it's going to be difficult. They need to be completely honest and say it is not going to be easy, it's going to be difficult." We spoke to lots of interviewees who wanted a flow chart. That was a repeated theme as well, and wanted to know kind of best and worst case scenarios from court and timeframes and possible outcomes. So these were repeated themes there. So this next standard, the information is available about the service and what support it can provide. This required a lot more balance, balancing up that information provided from the three sources, data, voice and practice. So what we heard from people with lived experience was a need for more emotional support through the criminal justice process. All interviewees identified the concept of having someone walk with them, accompany them, be in their corner, have their back, be their person as important. And they also highlighted the value of workers being available. But one focus group participants agreed that the DACA worker should be available for engagement almost straight away. A number of interviewees discussed the ideal option of having a 24-hour service. And one person highlighted the value of being able to contact their worker the night before the court case. When we discussed this with the court advocacy service managers, they identified that there was a risk of duplicating services. For example, there's already services that provide emotional support, local specialist domestic abuse groups, and there was also a resource constraint here in terms of what's practical around worker availability, as well as protecting worker welfare and creating clear boundaries about the role and remit. So I personally had put all of the emotional support burden onto the DACA worker and the DACA service, but it's not only their responsibility, this is a system-wide duty. We also heard here from COPFS that the role of the DACA worker needed to be very clear in terms of ensuring that clients understood it wasn't the equivalent of a solicitor. We had originally used language around preparing the client for trial. And our colleagues within COPFS pointed out that this could be interpreted as interfering with the judicial process or tarnishing evidence. So we changed that. We tempered and balanced this standard to ensure that the remit and the purpose and the limitations of a DACA service are very clear. And then that emotional support element, highlighted as a necessity by survivors, is included in the previous standard we discussed about being compassionate and domestic abuse competent, etc. We received really good feedback from the standard so far. Took these two to the European Domestic Violence Conference last year, and we got feedback that the language we'd used was soft, which we were really heartened by. So in a quick whirlwind there, I've explained the qualitative, collaborative and iterative research approach that we used, and I'll now hand over to Louise.
Thank you, Kirsty. This morning, everybody was sent out a copy of the standards, so we hope you can spend some time later on today looking through them. For now, we want to use today to really celebrate all the different ways everyone has helped to create the standards and reflect back on what we learnt. I want to know if you can see your input reflected in the standards. Firstly, let's celebrate everyone with lived experience who's shared their personal experiences of the criminal justice process with us. Everyone we spoke to took their time to honestly and delicately share their thoughts and reflections with us. Everyone told us very clearly what change is required. Each account either told us about what happens when someone is left in the unknown, on their own, or about the difference that domestic abuse court advocacy can have when the support is available. In one of the last interviews, at the end of the interviewee summarised, "If you're expecting a call at 3 o'clock and it doesn't come, you can be awake all night." And this really struck a chord with Kirsty and I. That one statement very clearly outlines what happens when agencies fail to call when they say they will. From that one statement, a very obvious standard was set, a very simple but vital minimum standard. See if you can find it. We want to celebrate everyone that came to one of our workshops. The enthusiasm of all participants gave us energy and motivation in turn. It didn't matter if the local area did or didn't already have a domestic abuse court advocacy service. Workshop attendees could always see and describe the benefits that the service would have. Workshop attendees could always paint a very clear picture of the status quo. For me, one description of a process that happens to them, not that they chose, shone a light on and put into focus the current situation for individuals caught up in the criminal justice process. It shines a light on the lack of control and choice that they have. Statements made in workshops answered questions that had been going around and around in my head. For weeks, we couldn't think how to describe the relationship between risk and court advocacy. And then one day, there it was, in a workshop, written on a flip chart, that domestic abuse court advocacy is risk focused, not just for high risk situations. One or two of the standard headings are direct quotes from a workshop. See if you can spot them, or you may be the person that said it. We want to celebrate everyone that participated in our workshop in Dundee. In partnership with Amina for Muslim and Black, Asian and racially minoritised women. From the moment that we walked in and someone stated to us, "This better not be like the other workshops where you come, take our ideas and we never hear from you again." From that moment, it was clear that we were going to be challenged and pushed in a good way. You told us that women need the correct information so that they can decide for themselves if it is safe to engage with the service. And hopefully you can see the standard that requires domestic abuse court advocacy services to provide clear information on the service they will offer. We want to celebrate our steering group members who shared their perspectives, who linked us in with other agencies. Every agency we have emailed has been happy to meet with us. We need to celebrate Lan, our researcher. She gave the thoughts and ideas in Kirsty and I's heads a process. She got us to think of significance, meaning, and feelings. She gave us a way to synthesise the information from the workshops. And she also managed to leave a jacket in every place she visited with us. We need to celebrate the managers of existing domestic abuse services who have repeatedly tested and quizzed us on what our standards will mean in practice. Thank you. Let's celebrate the participation groups with lived experience who have been involved throughout. the Authentic Voice Panel, Scottish Women's Aid's Reference Group, and Still I Rise in Falkirk. You took the standards and you questioned them. You rephrased them, you rewrote them, and you directed them. You questioned why and recommended what would be better. You've made the standards direct by changing services to this service. You've made the standards specific, pointing out that words like risk or impact, without any detail, are scary. You specified that risk from a partner or ex-partner is both a lot clearer and therefore safer. You've made the standard stronger by changing cans to wills. And for me, the standards aren't just a list of instructions. They're a completed jigsaw. They're a jigsaw that paints a picture of what's important and to who. These are our standards. They are not just the project standards. They are everyone's standards. So please, let's celebrate that. I'll now pass you to Gemma, who will take time with you to think about the different ways that the standards could be meaningful to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. I really appreciate that celebration today. This is absolutely something that we need to celebrate. So thank you so much for bringing that today. As we launch the Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy Standards today, I first want to take a step back and look at why we need domestic abuse court advocacy services. And rather than hearing from me, I want to share an experience from another member of our Authentic Voice panel, Tricia. Tricia told me, when I finally got my husband out of the marital home, I thought my life was my own again, and with my children I could start living again. How wrong was I? The stress and anxiety was just getting started. Throughout my marriage, he chipped away at my self-confidence, so by the end, I couldn't make the simplest of decisions. I couldn't trust in myself or believe my own thoughts. When the police first advised me they were prosecuting, I was relieved. I thought finally someone is hearing me. However, I hadn't realised it would take so long. It was months before the case appeared in court, and the whole time it is preying on your mind. The next horror was when I realised I was going to have to appear in court with my youngest daughter to give evidence. We went for a court visit before the hearing so that we could put our minds at ease. To say it didn't have the desired effect would be an understatement. Yes, we were shown the court, but when I asked about giving our evidence from another room, by video link or behind a screen, I was informed only children were allowed to do that. I had to be in the court and be face to face with my abuser. The letter we received from the court stating that we had to attend court or else we could be prosecuted didn't help the situation. It felt like the choice was out of my hands once again. I was back to doing what others were telling me. It's such a stressful time. You're dealing with police, getting alarms and extra locks fitted to your home, teaching your children about risk assessments and how they keep themselves safe when they're outside the home. All the time trying to keep life as calm as possible for them. I might not understand the whole court process, but I know the main focus should be on the victim and how to make their journey through court as stress-free as possible. Everyone involved needs to look at each case as individual. No one knows what the victims have gone through. They need to believe people are hearing them. Court isn't just about getting justice. It's about them being heard and being able to tell their truth. And so I'm going to take you to the next slide where we have a bit of a visual representation of exactly what Tricia's talked about there. So firstly, we have each of these blue circles, which represent different criminal justice agencies that a victim or survivor may encounter in the court process. As we've heard from both Helen and Tricia, being a victim or witness can mean that your experience is out of your hands and that support is not standardised. You may have heard elements of both their experiences and thought there's legislation and processes in place to prevent this from happening. But how are survivors and victims to know this? And how do they advocate for this on their own behalf? Each of these purple rectangles represents non-criminal justice agencies survivors will also commonly be in contact with as a result of experiencing domestic abuse. We expect survivors to understand the complex processes of each of these agencies, whilst also keeping themselves and their families safe. What Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy does is place the victim and survivor at the centre of this, supporting survivors to navigate through this complex process. I'm now going to show you the structure of one of our standards, so you can see how this will help to support survivors through the criminal justice system. So if we can move to the next slide, please. We've shown you elements of a few of the standards as we've gone through today's presentation, and the full standards have been sent to you and will be available on the SafeLives website after this. But rather than simply talking you through each standard, I wanted to use this time to think about what the standards mean for you. We want these standards to matter for everyone, just as Louise has said. And that means this could be in your professional life or in your personal life. Anyone can experience domestic abuse, you, your family, your friends. And we want to ensure that you know what an accredited service can provide. We also want to be clear on the key role domestic abuse court advocacy services can take in the complex criminal justice system and how this interacts with other agencies. You will see that each starts with a principle. Here, client safety is the priority, and under this sits the standards, the minimum expectations to meet this. We'll move to the next slide, where you will see the 7 principles under which each of the standards sit. We're going to open a Menti in a moment for you to share your thoughts on what they mean for you, and we will keep this Menti open throughout this section of the launch and encourage you to add any additional thoughts as we proceed. So for those of you who joined at the very beginning, you should already have that Menti link open, but for anyone who's joined slightly later, the Menti code is 11297338. So if you're able to go to menti.com, you can input that code 11297338. I'll give people a little minute to do that before we go back to the principles, so we can have those up for people to take some time to think about. Thanks, Hannah. So looking at these 7 principles and the standards that will sit below them, think about this really holistically. You may be attending today's launch in a particular role as a professional, but few of us don't have experience of domestic abuse outside our work, including our own experiences or friends or family. And as individuals attending, we can also think about what we'd want professionals to do with these standards. And I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that. So I'll keep this up so that you can have a read of that and to start inputting that. Can we pull up the Menti, please, Hannah? I know that's a very short space of time to look at them. And I hope, as Louise said, you have time to really engage with them in more depth later. Yeah, absolutely. It's important for survivors to know things are done right and well. Absolutely. An agreed level of service that is agreed and required for every survivor going through the court. That consistency, I see, consistency, standardised, consolidating best practice is really important there. And a safer and more inclusive experience for service users. Absolutely. Can we scroll down a little bit, Hannah? Sorry. We may have jumped a little bit. Yeah, better services. Professionalisation of the key role of advocate is really important there as well. Yeah, that women will be central to the process and receive an equal response wherever they approach for support. Absolutely. The level of expectation of what service users and professionals can expect is really key, and that will also vary across the different kinds of professionals that are engaged in this. If you think back to those two circles, there can be a huge number of professionals involved in each case, so understanding what the DACA service is doing is really important. Yeah. That survivors feel safe, confident, aware, and in control of the process as much as possible. Anyone could be a survivor. This is everyone's issue. Absolutely. And I love this very simple one, getting it right for victims. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we will collate these. We will share these as well. So thank you so much for everyone who shared that. I wish they'd existed during my own experience of domestic abuse. Absolutely. Choice, knowledge, empowerment, consistency, a sea change. Excellent, thank you. So what I'm going to do now is just go through a couple of different groups of people and how the standards might impact you. So I'll just give a second to move back to the slides. And as we move back to the slides, I have another quote from one of our excellent Authentic Voice panel. So this is V from our Authentic Voice panel. And this quote here is around why V chose not to report. And these were very serious offences. And you'll see here I've highlighted some of the reasons that are here, because equally, as well as the DACA standards supporting those who are currently going through court processes, there are also lots of people who we know could report their previous experiences, and the standards can be really beneficial for that as well. So as V says here, I didn't understand the systems. I've been a court advocacy worker, and I've worked with clients before who are lawyers, who are practicing in other areas of law rather than criminal, who find this really complicated. How do we expect people with no legal knowledge, or who might not have been brought up in our legal system, to be able to engage with the process? To have someone walk through not only the legal side, but to support with the other processes necessary for people who have experienced domestic abuse. So as Kirsty talked about, that ability to refer into specialist support for housing, health, social work, and emotional support. Isolation is really key here. The standards offer support from a specialist domestic abuse court advocacy worker at a time when survivors may have been cut off from their support networks. And we heard that in Trish's story there. Shame. Shame can be particularly pronounced for victims and survivors from certain backgrounds, which absolutely is the case for V here, but it's also common across most clients. There's shame around having experienced domestic abuse, having experiences spoken about in court, community, and as we found out in the workshops that Kirsty, Louise and Lan did, also in the media. And so domestic abuse court advocacy consists of domestic abuse support and court advocacy combined. And this is key when addressing fear of shame in the complex systems that we've heard. I didn't know who to tell. We expect that survivors know where to go with their experiences, evidence and needs. But as Helen also reflected on, it often isn't clear if these services exist, and in some areas they don't. Fear is key. We know that there are fears around safety, well-being, stability, the future, children, as we've referenced here. And so DACA workers provide risk assessment and safety planning throughout to address that. The standards mean that at a time when victims and survivors are coping with a huge amount of unknown, they can know what to expect from court advocacy service. They can make an informed choice about whether to engage with advocacy, and that they have an option for their voice to be heard. So as we move to the next slide, we're going to think about what the standards mean for our domestic abuse court advocacy services. Domestic abuse court advocacy provision in Scotland began only 20 years ago and is consistently developing, from advocacy only in a part of Glasgow to across 19 local authorities. Court advocacy has grown hugely, but is still not available across the whole of Scotland. The standards provide a clear way to ensure that we keep minimum standards of good, consistent and safe practice, as we heard about in those responses in the Mentee, and that victims will know what to expect from accredited services. And the services are also a really helpful blueprint for new and emerging domestic abuse court advocacy services. As we move to the next slide, and we think about what the standards mean for criminal justice agencies, what we know is that each agency in the criminal justice system has a specific role, and the role of a domestic abuse court advocacy worker complements this. It supports victims to better engage in processes and to provide the support around domestic abuse that is important. Domestic abuse court advocacy workers can liaise with criminal justice partners in a way that enhances the smooth running of the system. Domestic abuse court advocacy is the missing piece, and the standards clarify what criminal justice agencies can expect from domestic abuse court advocacy services. Thank you. Thank you for that, Hannah. And so who else may benefit from the standards? Members of the public and health, education, social work, etc. There's a huge amount of value in knowing what services are offering and what we can do. When someone comes to us and says, I've experienced domestic abuse, I think I might want to report, we can talk them through what support is available. We can know that they have advocacy in place, that they have a voice in that justice process. And also for funders, this is a really great framework on which to develop domestic abuse court advocacy across Scotland in a way that we know is consistent, is safe. So, as Louise said, the standards are for everyone. They're for all of us. And I really hope that today you're able to engage with that. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Gemma. And thank you to, just briefly before we move on to the input from Emma, thank you to Kirsty for coming back to join us today and talking us through that foundation to the DACA project, Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy Project, and in showing all of us here today how those standards were built up. That geographic breadth and depth of the work and just the thoroughness of each standard, each word of each standard did such justice to the incredible work that you, Louise, and Lan brought to that project. And just brought the standards alive for me, and I'm sure those in the room as well. Thank you to Louise for celebrating the hundreds of people who contributed their time and experience to these standards through workshops and other means, and in shining a light on how they made these standards. I thought that was beautifully done. And thank you also, Gemma, for bringing authentic voice again right to the forefront of this work in your input, for pulling out amazing reflections from our guests, including the AV panel, and in talking us through that client safety standard as well. And what the standards mean to services who have been and will be entirely vital to the future of this project. And a thank you from me to all those who are attending and have taken the time to attend from a current DA Court Advocacy service today. Just encourage all 200 plus guests that we have here today to take a look again at the 7 standards that we sent out this morning and just reflect on the work that has gone into these deceptively, deliberately concise standards. And I think the inputs that you've just heard do justice to that. But for now, we hand over to, in our last half hour, Emma Forbes of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service to just bring the project back to the broader justice system and wider domestic abuse context. So thanks so much, Emma, for joining us. A pleasure to have you, and over to you.
Thank you, Jess. Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here this morning and to be able to take part in this celebration of domestic abuse court advocacy standards for Scotland. As a prosecutor in court, I've seen the benefits of victim advocacy, not only when there's an established and effective information sharing, but also seeing victims empowered to be able to give evidence. On a personal note, listening to victims' stories and working with many of you during my own research has taught me yet more about what good advocacy can achieve. The advocacy standards being launched this morning are rightly, as we've heard, for everyone. The definition of domestic abuse in Scotland does not differentiate gender, age, or ethnicity. anyone can be a victim of domestic abuse. The challenge for police, prosecutors, courts and advocacy workers is to instill faith in the criminal justice system and its response to domestic abuse, and to break down compound barriers to reporting, some of which we've heard about this morning. I hope that we can translate these national standards in a way that engages men, women, non-binary, old, young, rich, poor, able, disabled, of all creeds and colours. That is a challenge. Today is International Women's Day. I would like to take a moment, if I may, to celebrate some incredible women who have taught me a lot about what effective advocacy means. I say celebrate. Their faces are hidden, their names are anonymised, their safety is still the first thought. I love this photograph that you can see on the slide. For me, it's a reminder of how far Scotland has progressed from the first advocacy service starting in Glasgow Sheriff Court in 2004. When Assist started almost 20 years ago, there was no MARAC, there was no risk assessment, and special measures were, well, they were rare. It's a photograph of an advocacy worker and some of the women that she has supported in Glasgow Sheriff Court. They're looking at an art installation that they helped to make. An art installation that raises awareness of domestic abuse and reminds others going to give evidence that they are not alone, that they are seen, and that it can get better. For me, it's an empowering reminder of women helping women. But this photograph also highlights three of the key components of advocacy, themes I'd like to explore with you now. The first is the importance of individual advocacy. The second is the strength of institutional advocacy. And the third is what advocacy can achieve for victims when they feel supported, heard and believed, the power to influence. Let's start with individual advocacy. The national standards embed a victim-centred approach where safety is key. Applied well, they ought to guide victims through the criminal justice system in a way that is more meaningful and retains individual agency. Reading these standards, which have been shared with you this morning, it would be easy to think that they completely encapsulate the role of the victim advocate. They don't. As the Minister highlighted, the standards are a benchmark. As Kirsty reminded us, emotional support is a service-wide duty. I'm honestly in awe of the creativity in the way that advocates support victims. Behind the scenes, they're providing a lifeline on the phone at points of crisis. They're ensuring that women and children eat a meal after being at court to give evidence, or waiting and not giving evidence. And they're signposting to a range of agencies and helping victims to navigate housing, social work, schools. There is such dignity in the way that this too often undervalued, empathic and adaptive victim-centred support is given. Incredibly, these victim advocates are quietly providing this range of support whilst helping victims to navigate what is a seemingly unbending, prolonged and confusing justice system. My favourite line from the standards is the promise that an advocacy worker can listen to your feelings and how the process is impacting on you. No one else will do this. No matter how hard we try, reporting domestic abuse, speaking to police and prosecutors, answering questions, going to court, waiting, and ultimately maybe giving evidence is likely to be re-traumatizing. Advocacy mitigates this. Could we have the next slide, please? The creativity of this advocacy for me is summed up in this. I met a friend at the shops and my eyes were sunk and she said, "Geez, you look terrible." I told her it was a bit of a domestic, whatever, and she said I had a terrible ordeal and I went to a place. I know it's difficult, but just do it. Nobody knows you. Just chap the door. The second theme is institutional advocacy, and Shepherd and Pence developed the Duluth model of power and control, which is the wheel that you will all be very familiar with, but they also talk about the macro and micro level of advocating for improvements, which I think is quite a helpful way to frame our understanding of what institutional advocacy is. There is evidence to show that victims are less likely to withdraw from the criminal justice process when they're supported by an advocate, which of course is a no-brainer. This is partly due to the part that the advocate plays in encouraging victims to remain engaged in a difficult process. And I appreciate that it can also sometimes feel uncomfortable within an ethos of a victim-centred approach. There is a presumption in Scotland in favour of prosecution, which is the correct approach, but sometimes this might mean remembering to prosecute for tomorrow, not just today. However, institutional advocacy is also the big picture. It's the crucial feedback that advocates can provide to criminal justice partners. The best example I can think of institutional advocacy is the Assist Bulletin. It comes out loyally every Friday. It's been in the same format since it started in 2004, and I hope that these brilliant national advocacy standards get a shout out in today's edition. Could we have the next slide, please? This quote sums up institutional advocacy and the fact that it's only possible with the support of victims, about them being brave enough to speak up and give back. We've been privileged to hear from Helen this morning, and we're reminded that there's still a stubborn perception reality gap between policy developments and victims' lived experience. It's the strength of women like Helen and the women I spoke to that no matter what's happening to them, they make it better for the next person. And that's what leads to progress. Next slide, please. The standards set out principles of individual and institutional advocacy, and applied well, I think they have transformative potential. Everyone working within the justice system is doing their best. They're looking at facts and information through the lens of their role. The advocate is centred in the victim's interest, and that puts them in a unique position to make sure that the impact of offending, safety fears, risk identifiers, and the needs of that victim are brought into the process. Next slide, please. I'll just give you a moment. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this is the image, shows the Lord Advocate and her unwilting commitment to improving victims' experiences in the court process. One of the things that I wanted to flag in terms of the COPFS commitment is that I've had some brilliant conversations with Gemma and Louise, and we are committed to inputting on the DACA training and the implementation of these brilliant standards. But it's also worth mentioning that there's a change to the law coming this summer to the way that the court considers bail. It will soon mean that prosecutors will have to address the court on the risk to the victim of the accused being granted bail. So let's just take a moment to think about that. The court will need to consider in every case the risk to the victim if the accused is granted bail. This means that prosecutors will have to rely on the professional judgment and expertise of the advocacy worker. I think that just highlights the importance of the role and the professionalisation that comes from these standards. I've also highlighted on this slide listening and how we can, as Women's Aid so eloquently put it years ago, from the voice of a child, listen louder. One of my key priorities in this role is to expand the range of ways victims can provide feedback and to create options for informal feedback. My perception of the complaints procedure is that it has its place, but it is potentially a barrier, as it can often, after a prolonged court process, feel like an extension of the justice response. And I hope that maybe providing a range of feedback options might, we've seen today at every turn how much we learn from listening to victims' experiences, and often there are ways to do that without it being a formal complaint or a letter saying you've been upheld or not upheld. So I hope that that's something that we can work with SafeLives, Assist, other agencies on the call today to put in place. Consistent embedded national advocacy provision ought to inform a more emotionally empathic justice response. I do think that we all have a job to do. We're focused on our role and just the unique position that the advocate has to bring voices of victims and their experience into the justice process will humanise that process in a way that perhaps it hasn't before. I do think that this is an opportunity to genuinely shift the structure of the criminal justice response in a way that's truly trauma informed and breaks down barriers that currently permit inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma, for a beautiful presentation and really clearly drawing on the research that you've done, which has also been so crucial in this. And one of the resources that's been used throughout the project so far to draw on that. I think it clearly demonstrates the need for this work and the need to for collaborative work and the role of COPFS being crucial in that. I love the way you describe the need or the duty, that it's a duty of all of us to provide emotional support throughout, and how that advocacy role can be a mitigator for re-traumatization, which I think has been mentioned throughout our day so far. So I think what we want to do now, we've got 10 minutes left, so we want to look, after hearing everything we've been doing up to now and then celebrating the standards so far, we've got more work to do in the project, and that's already been ongoing, but I think it's time to look at our next steps. So I'm going to hand back to Louise and Gemma to give you an overview of what they've already been starting and working on, and what they will be doing in the next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian, and thank you so much, Emma. So creating the Domestic Abuse Court Advocacy Standards is only the first step of our project. As we've talked about throughout, the standards are for everyone, and so our next steps include creating culturally sensitive translations of the standards to ensure that the standards are available in languages that are needed by our victims and survivors, and also developing a website where users can click on terms to find out what they mean or why we have included this.
One of the first standards sets out that workers are to be trained professionals who are domestic abuse competent, knowledgeable about the criminal justice process, trauma responsive, empathetic, non-judgmental, and realistic. We will support services to meet this standard by providing specialist training for workers. We plan to create an additional block of IDA training. IDA is Independent Domestic Abuse Advocacy. The current IDA training is a partnership between SafeLives, Assist and Scottish Women's Aid. It's SQA accredited and consists of 4 blocks of specialist training for domestic abuse professionals. We are now developing the 5th block.
We know from feedback that people would like to know more of how we build on the existing skills of domestic abuse court advocacy workers regarding incorporating lived expertise into the direction of delivery of services. And this will be one of the focuses of this specialist training.
We outline that a service cannot meet the standards unless it has successfully completed the accreditation process. Once the training programme is complete, we'll develop the process for accreditation and outline the different ways services can demonstrate that they are meeting our standards. And while this is all ongoing, we hope we can also support services to develop in new areas of Scotland. Our mapping and scoping report, which we should be publishing soon, found that there were possibly 13 local authorities in which domestic abuse court advocacy isn't yet available. Our aim is that anyone, anywhere in Scotland can access domestic abuse court advocacy support should they need it. And the standards are only our first step to achieving this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gemma and Louise. So I think, Lillian, with your agreement, I think what we'll do to keep this event to time and just to keep it to 11:30, which was our planned close time, we'll open the Q&A now through Steph and Hannah, who have been doing fantastic tech support throughout today and ahead of, so thank you to them. We'll open the Q&A to all our guests this morning in the actual chat of Teams. And we'd encourage you to ask questions around the standards themselves and the event today as well. And what we'll do is we'll allow the project team to respond carefully to these in time, just rather than rush one or two now. We'll then send those out to attendees as well. So please do put your questions into the chat with a commitment from us that those will be answered carefully and in time. I think at this point from me, what I'll do is just give a heartfelt thank you to all our speakers today for the thoughtful inputs and also the time taken in preparing and delivering those inputs, which were so well tailored to the DACA project and domestic abuse court advocacy more generally. That last input from Emma just rounded off the morning really well and reminded us of the incredible work that domestic abuse court advocates already do so creatively and so well. So a thank you from me. Again, just to all those who helped deliver the day as well. And Lillian, over to you.
A really big thank you to everyone who's been in attendance. I'm so pleased to see so many people here, and a really big thank you to Louise, Kirsty and Gemma for all the fantastic work that you've put into this. I'm so proud of this project, and I think it's a real, it really shows how collaborative working between Assist and SafeLives has bared fruit. So thank you, and thank you all again for today. And hope you all have a good rest of, a lovely rest of International Women's Day.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. We'll send out an evaluation and opportunities to contribute to the Q&A as well if there's any technical glitches. It looks like there might be, and I think that might be what a couple of the hands up are for. So thank you from us. We'll just stay on as people leave the event, but thank you for all your reactions, for taking part, and again, a happy International Women's Day as you enter the rest of your morning and into the afternoon, and happy Friday.